Hey folks, welcome to Snowpal Podcast. Our guest today is Nir Valtman, who's the co-founder and CEO of Arnica. Nir, just by way of quick introduction, has some interesting predictions about how AI will transform code security and security reviews. Nir believes that there will be a convergence of risk, vulnerability, and quality in a way that we haven't seen before. So that's a quick intro to Nir. Nir, thanks for taking the time to chat.
Hey, Krish. Excited to be here. So, yeah, definitely happy and excited about the conversation.
Super happy to learn a number of things about you, your company, and the topic that you suggested, which is pretty cool, actually. But before we get into the topic, if you could just give a brief introduction to yourself and your company to our audience, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, awesome. So maybe aside from the titles, I am a security practitioner. Previously started with as my name says that I'm an Israeli guy. I've been in the Israeli Air Force, did some IT and security stuff, then moved into consulting, did some penetration testing. I have some CVEs on my name. That's kind of how I like to geek around this, and ended up in management. Ran different security programs, both as a head of application security for companies like NCR, and also been a CISO for a couple of companies as well. So from the bottom to the top, and eventually when I came up with a problem that I wanted to solve back then, roughly 4.5 years ago, and I couldn't find a good enough vendor for me to solve it, I just went ahead and decided to found a company.
Lovely. Thank you so much for that. You said 4.5 years ago. In software terms and in the world of AI, I'm trying to think what that number even means, right? Whether it means like a 40 years, because things are changing at such a rapid pace these days that, it's just amazing. So a little bit about your company, right? And apologies if you said that, but an introduction to Arnica. I'm going to include links, obviously, in the podcast, but for folks who may not know your company already, can you just share a couple of things about your company?
Yeah, definitely. So in essence, at a high level, we're building this world in which software development is unimpeded by risk, and we can talk about what risk actually means. But in essence, what we believe in is that you can run different scanners across the entire development lifecycle, right? You can have scanners of the code, and they can be different scanners, static code analysis, as well as software composition analysis and secrets, and maybe scan containers. And I truly believe that finding vulnerabilities and even prioritizing vulnerabilities is not enough. And this is why we have a free platform that scans everything you need. And the real value that we bring is actually developer native workflows, where we interact with developers at the right time, not to mention with the right developer, and eventually end up making a real impact on risk reduction and getting up to the point in which you can actually stop the bleed and stop chasing your own tail when it comes to essentially reducing risk for the company. So that's a high level.
I think that's very good. The topic that you had recommended just before I hit record was, I'm along the lines of the impact of AI on SDLC. But before we go there, based on what you just mentioned there, I have a few questions because you said a number of interesting things there. So Nir, can you take an example of, vulnerability is a broad topic, right? It sort of spans the spectrum. So just to keep the conversation a little more focused to the extent possible, that way I can, orient my questions around that piece of the puzzle. Can we take one or two vulnerabilities that you generally have seen? It could be as simple as you may want to think of, or as complex as it could be. And then we can take those as examples and then sort of orient the rest of the conversation around those types of vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I think that we can take, the recent examples. It can be as old as the log4j's, or it can be up to the latest vulnerability. I think that vulnerabilities become complex when you need the context of understanding the exploitability of this vulnerability. So, for example, if you're thinking about, the Shai Harud vulnerabilities, that was also a software supply chain security attack that happened recently. At the end of the day, let's say that you're looking for a package that you are using in your code, and you're using a package maybe with an old version, and you have a CVE, meaning a vulnerability that is published for this, and you will get a recommendation to go and upgrade. In reality, and you probably know this, Krish, from your experience as a CTO, taking and migrating a package version can introduce break-in changes.
Absolutely.
And sometimes you can say, you know what, I have, maybe 10, 20 vulnerabilities for this version. And I want to go and migrate with a, let's say, talk semantic versioning. That can be, I can go with a minor or patch version, but I can't really make a decision on a major version upgrade. And therefore, a piece of your decision tree as a developer is, okay, do I have a partial win here, right? And the partial win can be, okay, I'll take a patch version that will address, I don't know, 70% of my issues. And then you do something to reduce some risk. Now, we can actually take it one step back and say, you know what? Maybe Krish doesn't need to take an immediate action at all.
Okay.
So not only that you can say which version needs to be kind of effective, but also you can say, you know what? Let's actually check if this vulnerable function in the CVE is actually used in the source code.
Okay.
Right? And if you can determine, it's called reachability in our world, reachability analysis. And there are multiple types of reachability analysis. But in essence, what you can do is you can do it deterministically or non-deterministically. It's really up to you. You can actually say, let's actually search for this kind of code smell that shows us that it can be exploited, and then make it a priority.
Okay.
This is
So this is
simpler,
very good.
complex.
No, it's very
Yeah.
good. I think you said a number of things, and I would like to jot down some notes, but I'm either good at listening or writing it down. If I do both at the same time, I do neither of them well enough. So I'm going to try and remember the parts that make the most sense. They all make sense, but the parts that I want to follow up on, right? So you mentioned many interesting things. Let me start with the most recent of what you said there, which is you're going to look for the reachability, correct? You found a vulnerability of a package, and we'll go to what that means at the package level and the dependencies across packages. But you're like, you know what? Where does this vulnerability make a difference in the code essentially? Where are we literally using it and where the impact could possibly be? But to me, if I drew a spectrum near, would you agree that that is actually the more complex of, I mean, otherwise, the simplest way to do it would be, you know what? Let me see if there is a newer version of this package that works beautifully and there are no issues and it seamlessly works with the rest of the dependencies. If that happens, then we are all happy. That's the easiest thing to do. Get the latest version, put it, and we're done and dusted. That is not always the case, like you mentioned. There are times when it's not going to work, it's going to create breaking changes. But even before it creates breaking changes, my first question is, what about the dependencies on other packages, right? That's part of the problem, right? Because now you have these interdependencies between all of these versions. How do you go about addressing them? And do you see them as a challenge?
It looks like, I don't know if you ever tried it, but it looks like it's very intentional question.
Okay.
The reason why it's such a great question is because what we do in our product is that we actually open every risk based on the direct package, the direct dependency. So if you think about like I don't know, let's say an npm based package, and you have a log file, what we do is that we report on the direct package and we say, if you upgrade this direct package to this version, we actually rebuild the entire dependency tree of this,
Okay, hang on.
right?
So I have a number of other dependencies on that file, and you're going to be like, whether it's a gem file or npm or whatever, depending on the
It
language
doesn't
we're
matter.
using, you're going to go look to see, okay, this package has the vulnerability, but if we did an upgrade to the higher version, these are the other packages that would potentially be impacted by this change.
Yes. And also, if this package is transitive package, we're saying, okay, you can't really update to this transitive package by itself. That may break the rest of the packages. And therefore, we'll look at, we're building the dependency tree, and we're saying, oh, this package actually comes from another package. If you upgrade the other package, it will cascade the fix to this package.
And will you be able to tell any breaking changes that this might bring to the table?
Well, that's where you can actually look at the AI case, right? Because in
Okay.
this case, um, there's no good enough solution that I have seen that can tell you if something can break your changes or not. And there are multiple solutions. You can use AI to analyze the change log. You can use AI to look at the code diffs. At the end of the day, I believe that that's what we have seen, is that it's really hard to tell in a complex dependency tree if something will break where some of that code is not yours.
I was just trying to get lucky there, Near, to be honest with you, because we are a polyglot shop, and one of the languages and frameworks we use is Flutter. And every time we do a Flutter
Yeah.
upgrade, we keep our fingers crossed because hell almost always breaks loose, right? For n number of reasons. And one of the reasons is these packages. Sometimes you're deeply ingrained and dependent on those packages, and you cannot replace them, right? It's simply not possible. And you run into these types of issues, which brings me to the other end of the question I was going to ask you with what you said earlier is you mentioned reachability. Hey, you know what? There are dependencies. There is a vulnerability that we need to address here. We can't let it slide. So we're going to look deeper. We're going to have to make some code changes, right? Maybe the hardest way to fix an issue because you have to do it that way. And you look for methods, functions, dependencies in your code base that your team has written to see how it's leveraged that particular package. And let's say you did a couple of high level questions there. Can you give us an example of how do you tie the package and its breaking changes or the vulnerabilities and or to the actual code dependencies based on code that your team has written? How does that work? Hey, you know what? This is the package. These are all the 17 places we are using that. But of those 17 places, the vulnerability only might come into play in 6 of these 17 places. So you don't have to address them in entirety, but you have to focus your attention to that six, a small subset of it.
That's actually a built-in mechanism. In our case, we're not saying where it's not impactful. We're actually saying only where it is impactful. The hard part, I think, and this we do this when we see absolutely zero instances of this reachability, right? So the easy part is to say, I have this code smell. The thing that you need to gain as a vendor to get the trust of the developer and the security team is when you say that something is not reachable. Because, like, what happens if there's a breach tomorrow, right? So you're taking a huge bulk of a responsibility when you're saying that something is not reachable. And it's something that I've seen taken very lightly by a few others. And therefore, what we do is that we see, hey, let's spend more time and more resources on the validation if it actually exists. And if it's not, we're going to automatically reduce that risk for you. And we'll say, don't worry about it.
Okay. And
Right.
as a
And the main difference, by the way, in my mind, is that of course you have typically in a security product you have a security operator that logs into a product like this, like a application security product. In my mind, the difference is, does the developer get a notification or not? Do you make a noise for the dev? Yes or no? And this delineation is why we're making the other assessment.
Okay, makes sense, right? And thing I want to ask you here, Near, is surely you want to address them, right? At least the high priority, the high severity ones, you have to address them. There's no question about it because you don't want to have a breach of any kind and then have to do firefighting, and it's going to cost a lot of time and money. It makes complete sense. But that being said, I want to get your thoughts on this. As a company or as a startup, right? If you come and tell me, Krish, here is a bunch of features that customer comes and tells us we need these three features, or you'd be better off if you had these three features, and let's say at the same time we found three or two other vulnerabilities. Right now, to be very honest with you, while that's more important to address the vulnerability so your system functions better than it does or as securely, part of you is like, you know what, I want to build the features, right? Because that seemed like your product gets bigger and broader and wider. So it's almost like the vulnerability is a cost center until the point you get breached and hell breaks loose. And you're trying to have your focus on things that you think are important, which are the features. Do you typically see organizations have sort of a conflict of interest, for lack of a better word, between spending that same dollars on building more software, more features, than addressing issues and vulnerabilities in existing software?
Yes, I think that maybe I'll answer it in the developer workflow world. Okay, the way to think about it, when a vulnerability is in production, you need to open, I don't know, like a Jira ticket, talk with a product manager. It's very expensive to go and fix this vulnerability, resources standpoint, and you will likely get the product manager to prioritize something else unless you have any regulatory requirement or so on, contractual, regulatory, whatever, or boots.
Right.
With that said, my state of mind is that you have so many security products that interact at the PR level, right? Either in a CI/CD pipeline, which is, we can talk about the challenges right there because low adoption, dependency on engineering teams, and so on. But for those even newcomer solutions that can interact in that every pull request level, you will see that the effort that it takes for a developer to focus on this and fix is exactly the same. Because I just, it's in a code review stage, technically, right? Code review stage means that I'm done writing my code. Right, which is already too late, and therefore, when you think about developers, right, you have a team. At the end of the day, your developers commit on delivering something at a certain amount of time, right, or a specific date, and then the first time that they see this vulnerability is in their pull request. Well, that's great. It delays them. Obviously, bad experience for the devs. They may deprioritize this, maybe bypass any gates that you may have in the pipeline or in the PR, right? Like brand protection rules and so on. And that becomes a really bad experience. Now, you can say, I have IDE plugins and I have the ability to scan early on. Realistically, the adoption of security plugins is roughly 20% across all of the devs. And they don't have the interest. They're not measured on security. But they do code quality, well, in a bigger adoption. So there must be a magic place where you can notify the dev to make it a low effort in the mind and the focus to fix something right now to avoid getting this into the pull request. And the two ways to do this. Don't scan only the PRs. Scan every single code push to the branch. That's pretty much what Arnica does.
Okay.
We scan every single code push at the branch. I'm not trying to sell the solution. I'm just telling you.
No, Nick. Totally makes sense.
Of course.
Yeah.
But in essence, we scan every code diff at the branch, and then if we find any vulnerability in the diffs, we then communicate with the developer over Slack or Teams privately, because developers don't want to be blamed or shamed in channels, right? So you do it privately to the dev, and you give the dev the opportunity to fix while the code is saved and changed in that context.
Nir, let me interrupt you there. Right? Let me make sure I follow that correctly through. So you said not wait till the time the pull request is submitted, right? Not till the PR is submitted, but during the course. But let's say, but you said every code commit. I want to understand that better. Now, how each team does its feature work. I mean, there's some basic standards, but there are fair amount of nuances there. So I'm going to make an assumption here because I do it three different ways depending on the language that I'm working on, for instance, right? But let's say we have a draft PR, correct? So a draft PR, and depending on teams, there are teams where when I see a draft PR pop up, it's my inclination and nature to just start looking at it while we've generally told people that, hey, you know what, encouraged to create draft PRs, but don't worry, nobody's going to look at it, but never happens, right? You're always curious. You start looking to see early mistakes there. So you're talking about commits, right? So which means is the assumption here, but somebody has a draft PR and they're making commits to that, correct?
No need. You can do it before you open the draft PR.
Which means they push the branch.
Is also so think about it this way. You checked out the branch, you started committing code, and end of day, end of whatever, whenever you save your work to your Git SCM, you push it to a branch, right?
Right.
And you may work on a feature for a while. It can be yourself, it can be an AI with reprompting, retesting, whatever the workflow that you have, it can be on the branch itself.
But hang on. But Nir, what you're saying is just the process there, right? Because in our case, the moment you do the first push, right, we expect a draft PR to have been created at that point. But your assumption here is maybe, maybe not, but you're saying regardless whether or not the draft PR is in play.
Yeah, draft PR is a very specific concept to GitHub. But that's
my bad.
not the world.
Sorry. Okay. It's not there in other systems. All right. Okay. So in other words, if the developer is doing local commits, sure, that's too early. But the moment they decide that, hey, this commit is good enough to not be local, but I'm going to push it to the server, at that point, this comes into play, correct? Okay. Makes sense.
Exactly. And by doing so, essentially, it's a real-time system. You plug it into webhooks, right?
Okay.
So you're now not dependent on any build pipelines or independent on any code changes that you'll ask your developers to introduce to run a security scanner. And now you can actually control everything centrally, no matter how many developers you have, which solves a fundamental problem of developer adoption of any scanner. We're talking about security, of course, but it can be any scanner. Think about a center of excellence scanner that scans for your API governance. Think about linter that is running across a company. I think about different types of kind of checks that you could run if you're utilizing this approach.
So Nir, I have a number of questions for you, right? It's a very developer question, if you will, right? So please humor me here. There is a certain sense of developer freedom that each developer needs. What that freedom is and how that's defined, it varies and it spans the spectrum. Like if somebody saw me code every minute, my fingers don't move. But there is a world where people do mob programming and whatnot, and it works for some people and doesn't work for other people, right? So keeping that as context. Now, let's say I'm a developer who wants to complete the work. Now, again, before we go into the pros and cons of that approach, I want to get a functionality working quick and dirty, right? Meaning I want it to be working before I worry about the cleanliness of that code, the scalability of that code, the security of that code as well, because I want to get my basic first steps going. If that is my premise and personality as a developer, how does this play? Because now I know that, hey, Krish, the moment you push, there's going to be things that pop up and start red flagging because there could be vulnerabilities that are caught. And I was not even ready to address them because I want to get done with what I'm doing. So, what is your experience in this space, Nir, from based on developers you've seen and worked with? How do they react to it coming into play even before they've completed that feature?
I think that it's all about the threshold and the gating that you decide to set in place. The way that I like to look at this world of problem is that you need to be able to classify where do you want to govern hardware gates and where you want to govern software gates. And in the world that I live in, we have a business importance priority on every repo or every product that you define, and you can define different gates. You can define different gates for different branches. You can define different gates per path. Maybe it can be a naming convention of a repo. Like if you call it anything innovation dash whatever, by default, that would be a soft gate. You'll get the notification as an FYI, a notification, but it will not block you from taking it to the next level, right? Because at the end of the day, there's a balance between developer freedom and governance. And governance can be either strict because you must do this, and this is where hard gates come into play. There's also, hey, we just want you to know, and you can decide what you want to do about it. And this is where the soft gating
I think
is applicable.
That makes perfect sense. And plus, you also mentioned that it's private. In other words, I'm not paranoid about this because it tells you're staying. There is a way for it to slack me privately and say, "Hey, Krish, we found two vulnerabilities that are Sev 1 in your commit. You may want to address that." So that way, I still have the space to fixing it. Right? I'm notified early enough, but it's not public information. There's a chicken hanging on the cube or something of that nature. Right? Okay.
Exactly. And it's applicable, by the way, if you're thinking about it, there are ways to even get you as a developer to avoid having those types of notifications, not by opting out, but by actually utilizing something that is very similar to cursor rules or AI coding rules. So if a developer is utilizing either local agents or even, kind of SaaS-based agents, right? At the end of the day, again, you'll have exactly the same problem I mentioned with IDEs when it comes to MCP. Right? You can't just give an MCP to every agent because the agent doesn't know when to use it. And it becomes, even when you talk about skills, it's not 100% that it's going to use those skills, right? And the way to think about it is that, I don't know, Krish, did you manage to use any type of cursor rules, Copilot instructions?
Yeah, we do, right? Based on the
Right?
IDE, like we use JetBrains and VS Code, right? So the tools, the plugins that work alongside with those IDEs. Yep.
Yeah, and eventually you can create those markdown files that that essentially the agent picks up those markdown files and starts writing code according to those markdown pieces, right? So you'll develop a requirement that says build me this, I don't know, login page in this way, and if you have the rules file, it will actually build it according to how you set it to be built for that repo, right? The question is then, how do you get to the point where developers write, let's call it secure code by default, or it can be even, let's call it governed code by default. It can be, the center of excellence, as I mentioned, right? And the way to do this is by simply applying those rules into every repo that you have in the company. But there's multiple researchers that actually show that most of the engineering teams, most of the companies where they use AI coding, they use more than 2 tools for AI coding. So now you have a fragmented process between different engineering teams, right? So one team will use Cursor, another team will use Claude, and another team will use, like a Copilot. And then they're not picking up exactly the same files. It doesn't work the same. So how do you get to the point where you control everything that happens in a company to be secure or governed by default? The way to do this, and this is something that I'm super excited about because we released it in November, you can actually inject those rules into every repo. It's not creating a pull request, because if you're a security vendor, for example, and you create a pull request for every repo in the company, the likelihood of this PR to be merged is very low because developers are not measured on it. You don't need to review PR by a bot, right? No one pings you about it. It's not a priority. And you can even be punished about it because you didn't focus your time on what you need to do, right? Like productivity tools can punish you about that. The way that we actually implemented this, it's very similar to how Semver type of plugins work in pipelines. When you see a code change and it automatically commits a new version for you.
Right.
We do exactly the same thing. We piggyback on PRs. And when the PR is created, we see, hey, do you have this rule file for whatever is defined for the company? As I said, Claude and Copilot, right? If we don't see this rule file that is governed by this central team that can have security and non-security requirements, we then add a new commit to the head of the branch of this PR, and that's the bot commit. So if you want to merge this code, you need to merge this with this file.
Okay, makes sense.
Right? And then the moment it's merged, everyone from that moment are writing secure code by default or governed code by default. And that brings this to this kind of loop in which, or flywheel, where developers don't need to get more notifications from the vendor. They automatically suppressed by the rules that the agents pick up.
Makes sense. Okay. Nir, thank you so much for the specificity of those answers, right? Because it does make a difference, at least for the developer audience that's watching or listening to it. There is a lot of value in actually being as specific as you are. We have about 15 minutes to go. I have a number of things to ask you. So I'm going to make this, if you want to respond to these in like under a minute or as quickly as you can, so I can get through a list of high level questions I have in my mind. Everything based on what you just told. First thing is, one of the things I've seen based on podcasts I've watched or listened to, CISO podcasts, one thing I've heard repeatedly is, hey, you cannot build a system that's 100% secure or not vulnerable at all. I mean, that's an impossible dream to achieve or even try to achieve. So there are going to be those vulnerabilities. So you're going to have to draw a balance and see how to address them as quickly as you can when it gets to that point. But one way that some of them have recommended is keep a tab on the number of features that you build. I honestly did not understand that line of thinking as much. That being the premise, my question to you is, there has to be an impact of giving importance to vulnerabilities, right? Because you ought to, right? There's no question about that. But if I could have otherwise built 100 things, how much can I expect to build because I'm starting to give importance to security? Is it 90? Is it 70? Is it 60? Like if you have to give a ballpark number, what would that be?
That's a really good question. Let's think about how to quantify this. At the end of the day, we're talking about wasted time for developers on security. Like this is the topic, right? How much time is wasted? So let's break it down. As of today, a developer spends 15%, roughly 15% of the time on code reviews. Today, obviously, as AI evolves, they will spend more time on AI code reviews, but now it's roughly 15% of the time. Again, different research, different academy pieces that I found. 63% of all of the issues flagged by any AI code reviewer are dismissed by developers.
Oh my God. Okay. I didn't know that. That's good to know.
Okay. It's not security. It's like everything.
Anything,
right?
Yeah.
So you see that actually developers distrust those AI code review tools, and they're wasting the time for the developers. So if you had a good mechanism to, one, to be preventative mechanism. So actually, let me pause. With everything that I just said, the 15% and the
63. Yep.
63%. Let's say that 15% of the time of the weekly time, that would be 6 hours a week. Most of this time is on dismissing stuff, right? So let's say 3 hours. 3 hours of your 45 hours a week. That would be what, like
In terms of
six,
percentage?
six,
Yeah.
8%, yeah,
Right. Yep.
6, 8%. So if you manage to reduce that noise and you got the developers to actually spend the time on the reviews, regardless if it's a security or non-security, any piece that involves AI code review, that I know security is famous in this today as well, you could actually get that percentage back. So
Okay.
instead of developing 100 features, actually you want to develop 100 features, but you can actually develop 106 features if you had the
Okay.
right process.
Fair enough, right? My next question is
Freestyling.
okay, right, totally. The transparency of this process. In other words, if I am a developer who's focused on building user interface functionality, or maybe the backend systems or middleware, doesn't matter. The less time I have to know or spend on security related items, if that's not the core of what I'm doing, and the more transparent that process and the tagged commits are. Hey, Krish committed something. That was an issue. The tool goes and fixes it and commits it back. So it's there, meaning it was entirely transparent to me. The scenario is, if it's 100% transparent, I have no idea something is even happening. Things are magical. But that's utopia, right? Whereas if it's 1%, which means I have to be engaged in every problem it's reporting. Where do you think the tools generally are in terms of developer involvement and engagement in fixing those vulnerabilities during the process of building software?
That's exactly one of the biggest challenges that exist today in cybersecurity. You have many issue reporters, and today I think that almost every application security product actually has a like code suggestion, code fix. It's still, like you mentioned, the draft. So I suppose you're talking about GitHub. In GitHub, you can actually suggest a comment, right? You suggest a code change, right?
Right?
So you can annotate code in PRs, and you can actually see the merge rate of those comments. Realistically, it's still a waste of time. In the place where you want to be, in like ideal place, I'm going back to controlling the rules. If you can commit yourself back to the rules that AI agents pick up, you can get to the place where you automatically avoid those issues. But how do you know that they were avoided? Because you don't have an event on GitHub, you don't have a comment. In our prompt that we inject to every repo, we actually require the agent to cite or document every piece that he respected from our rules. So, for example, if you wrote, I don't know, if you have a secure logging mechanism, right? The secure and truncate sensitive data, whatever, right?
Right?
You have this secure logging requirement. Every time that it will use a secure logging function, it will also add a comment that says, I'm using the secure logging function because I respected this rule. And then when you look at your code, and you know how search can happen, you can look at your code and look at the amount of comments generated by your agents. You can see how much or how many issues were not reported because of that.
Okay.
It's
Makes
like the
sense.
opposite search. It's don't search the bad stuff, tell it how to do the good stuff.
Makes sense. Right.
Eric, ad generation.
We
Yeah.
got 10 minutes to go. I'll see what other questions I have left here. But before, one of the things we want to talk about, we have little time, but the impact of AI on the software development lifecycle, right? If you have to say in 2 minutes, Nir, what would some of that be?
Yeah, and it's very much tied to what we just discussed. So think about it this way, even Microsoft CTO suggests that or predicts that roughly 90% of the new code will be generated by AI by 2030, right? And there's a lot of implication to what it actually means. The meaning is not that only code will be written by AI. The meaning is that there's significantly more code being generated that takes you to the place where there's way more risks introduced by AI. And by saying way more risks, it can be a security risk, it can be an architecture risk, it can be memory leaks that can cause a denial of service, it can be different risks, logical risks that you may have, business logic risk, multiple risks that can happen because AI doesn't have the product expertise. Not that it can see a call graph, but it doesn't have the product expertise. Not only that, the problem of generating those risks is not only that they exist, but also by the fact that roughly 13% of the code is attributed to the AI agents. But that's it. So most of the code is not attributed to AI agents. And by doing so, it's really hard to solve the ownership problem when it comes to actually, fixing a vulnerability. Or, in your world, Krish, it's like the Git blame problem. Like, you don't know who to blame. You don't know who has the expertise to fix something if the author is not you or a developer, right? Now, because of this increase in risk and the lack of ownership, you need to do more code reviews, right? You need to go through a more thorough process. Now, to get this more thorough process, you need tools to scan for AI issues or with AI. Scan AI with AI, right? And there are already different security tools that can do AI scanning, like we do, of course. But there's also different tools that do AI code review that are more of a general purpose AI code review. The vast majority, as I mentioned, the 63% is already dismissed. It wastes time for the devs. Sorry. So all of that gets to the point in which now the bottleneck is the reviews. Now, to unlock this bottleneck, hours and an effort wise, you need to have this again flywheel that also builds a sort of tribal knowledge around how developers interact. Think about it as like if your GitHub is a system of record of your code, you need a sort of a system of context that will be able to build the context around how developers interact with every issue generated in this ecosystem, and then actually go and implement this tribal knowledge back into the rules.
Okay.
So that the next time that the code is generated and more code is generated, it won't be flagged as a risk. And then you won't spend that much time on code reviews. And that's kind of how it
I got it.
always
Thank you.
goes back
We
and
got
forth.
like 5 minutes, and I have two things to ask you, and then I'll let you ask me anything you want to ask me. The thing is, let's say really quick in 30 seconds, right? So somebody's writing code in the team. The team is like 4 developers or whatever. They keep writing code. They're checking in. The tool comes into play. After a certain point of time, the tool has learned enough about this team, the type of code that they're writing, the kind of code they're writing, the type of problems they're solving. So do you see tools become more personalized with the use of AI and the data and LLMs and whatnot? So now it starts recommending not just based on a list out there in the world, but maybe using something like RAG or something that says, you know what, I know how this team is writing. I know where their weaknesses are. So let me look for these types of things.
That's exactly what I just mentioned about the tribal knowledge, right? Every tribe has its own knowledge for the good and the bad, right? So you want to know, for example, which issues you reported that were dismissed, and you want to see what the teams actually know and can give you as a context, and then you can find them and fine tune the question that is being asked around the knowledge that they provided. So, for example, let's say that you have an e-commerce product, and the context is that you have APIs, right? It's what the AI agent understands. But what you want to give to the scanner is, I actually have a shopping cart, and for me to check out, to run the checkout API, I first need to see an item. I need to add this item to the shopping cart, and only then I can check out. So you need to educate it with the business context, and only then it will be able to ask the right questions and build
Makes
on top of
sense.
it, if that makes sense.
No, perfect, right? So we have 3 minutes to go. I have a non-technical question to ask, but before I did that, do you have any questions for me, Nir?
Yes, I also am curious, what are your thoughts about how the development lifecycle is changing with everything that is going on with AI?
Yep, I'll give you my 2 minute answer, right? I think, there's different schools of thought. And for somebody like me who's been building software for 2 decades or so, I know a lot of people who are in this space who are not entering the workforce, doing it the way they could possibly do it today. but people have done it a certain way and have certain muscle memory. There is a lot of unlearning and relearning to do. No question about that. No one can afford to be lazy if you're in that space of having built software and building it now. The impact is very broad because one of the things we do here is we build APIs for other people to consume and integrate and build software quicker. How we've gone about doing that has changed, not like 2%, 5%, 10%, right? We've literally taken a step back saying, you know what, we know this is what we want to be able to do, but how do we go about doing that? Every step of the way has an impact, because when people ask me if AI is only making a difference to the actual building of the software, meaning the code writing part with code generation tools and how many developers you need or don't need, I think it's changed from your business team communicating requirements to you, to the product management team digesting those requirements and giving it to the dev team. Earlier, they did not give the dev team code, but now they can give the dev team code. You don't need the junior developer to write 70% of that code. You have tools to generate that code. So the type of exchange that happens in a software team has to change completely. But the thing is, the tools and software and AI moves at a much faster pace than humans. It's just the natural way of things. I mean, looking at Meta and Nvidia and all these hyperscalers and how fast they're adopting these tools and how many billions they're spending, I've seen as no reflection of how fast it's going down the pipeline when it comes to smaller companies, right? Like mid-sized companies or really small companies. So there is this gap between how people have to pick up their skills or relearn what they've done or unlearn and relearn versus how your mind is able to do it. And I think that's where the next set of challenges are going to be. A lot of people know I don't want to do it the way I've done it in the past, but what's the right way to do it for the problems that you're solving in the team that you're working with and with the resources that you have? I know it's a high level answer. I'm just rushing through to meet the time, but hopefully that makes some sense there.
I must ask you something else
Please.
based on this. Listen, I think this is the right direction. 100%, in alignment with this. One of the things that I've seen is non-technical people, prompting for, vibe coding a complete app, like replacing a complete CRM system in a matter of a couple of days. And I wonder, what are your thoughts strategically and what it actually means for companies trying to build, a software that can be very robust, but maybe you need a small piece of the functionality, and then will any companies suffer from the ability to just repeat fundamental use cases by just vibe coding your way in?
It's a great question. So, Nir, you're a brilliant guy, obviously, and I love talking to you. You have the time. I can keep going. How much time do you have? So I know I can.
I can do like 8, 10 minutes.
Perfect, right? And if I drop off, tell me within a minute and we'll say good and we'll go. This is amazing. I can keep talking to you all day long. So, the gist of the question I took away, correct me if I'm wrong, Nir, so I answered correctly, is the question really, is vibe coding viable or good enough to take a product through to production? Is that the basic premise of the question?
Yes, for limited use, for like internal use for companies.
Not for production systems used by end users, but for internal use.
Yes.
I'll answer it both ways because I had a chat with a couple of founders in the last 3 days or last 5 days, so I can give you a more specific answer. One of the founders told me that she had never written code, right? She started a company. It's a kind of company based out of Canada. She has some, experience in the business of software, but never written code herself. And then she had an idea and she wanted to take this through to MVP, right? And then to production. And she had to look for people. And the people she ended up hiring were two students in college who were in the third year or second year. Now, this is amazing to me. Now, the product went through MVP and it's in production. So my initial question was the obvious one, which is 2 years ago or 3 years ago, or even a year and a half ago, maybe you could not have done this. You had to spend that money, look for investments as a non-engineering founder, go hire somebody, trust that they'll do the job well. And if you cannot afford, you go outsource it. And then that comes with a plethora of other problems, depending on which part of the world you go to and whatnot. But she had to do none of that. She was able to go to college or find somebody and give them an internship and work with them. And she took it through to MVP and then further to production. So my initial question was, okay, now you don't write code. They have not written code for long. I mean, for n number of, not that number of years means something here, but just in terms of experience, right? They're just still in
Mm-hmm.
college and learning. I've been in college long enough, Near, but the way I look at college education is a discussion for another day in this day and age. So I know you take it whatever college gives you, right? So my question was, how do you, I mean, you're talking vulnerabilities that are complex, right? And even a very seasoned architect and engineer takes time to understand some of these things. I'm asking questions about the basic functioning of the product or piece of software. If it's a user interface, I can click, click, click without knowing anything until it's working, right? But I don't know if the sequence of clicks were to have changed, will the product still function? Will it scale, right? That's a different question. So when I asked her this question, she told me, Krish, to be honest, I think I'm paraphrasing what she said near, but I don't understand code. I have not looked at any of this stuff. Have not seen any of this, which means nobody's seen any of what the code was generated. And she said about 90% of the code or more was completely generated code, right? Only 10% of the code was actually written. Now, one part of me is like, this makes sense, right? Now, this is going to scare the heck out of an average developer saying, oh my God, I don't need developers anymore, right? But her point was, you know what, I can take it through to MVP, maybe to production if I have a few users onboarding the system. But if the scale increases here, if I have some real problems and seriousness coming out of it, at least the way I took away from what she said was, I'm going to need a developer. And I'll answer the second part of what you asked there based on another answer I got from another founder, which was like, I need these developers. I don't need junior developers. I asked them specifically, do you need junior developers anymore? They're like, not really. A lot of it, I can do it as a non engineer, build it. And where I need help, I need a senior dev to help guide me and say, this is right, this is wrong, which means the space for junior devs is sort of disappearing, which aligns well with what Mark Zuckerberg had said on one of his podcasts, I think, which is like Meta is seizing the hiring of junior developers for the most part. They're only going to hire senior devs. So I don't know if that answers some of your questions here, but that's how I see it. Meaning the team's composition is changing dramatically, right? You're not going to have three developers, one tester, one part-time product manager, part-time scrum master. Everybody is going to have to do a number of different things, but how they go about doing it and whether a developer comes into play before 70% of the code is written or not becomes a question on a daily basis because people are able to build stuff without developers entirely.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's my at least answer to you now. We have a couple of more minutes to go. Very simple question or simple based on how you think it is what is your favorite food? Like what is the one dish that you would name that is your, hey, this is what I like eating? And since the audience is pretty much spread out, you may have to explain that if it's very specific.
Oh man, I'm such foodie. That's going to be a difficult one. I'd say that I live in the South here in Atlanta area, and we just need to grill stuff. That's as simple as that. So I rarely go to steakhouses. I like to make my own smoked meat, veggies, eggs.
No, just one Nir, just one dish. Sorry, just pick. Yeah.
I'll do a brisket.
Do you mind just explaining it to people?
A smoked brisket?
Yeah.
Yeah, a smoked brisket, for me, it's just, taking a huge chunk of meat, brine it to make it a little bit spicy and put it in a smoker 12, 13 hours, take it out and eat it with a fork.
Sounds good to me. I'm vegetarian, but it sounds very, very tasty already.
Sorry about that.
That no problem. Nir, this was amazing. I really enjoyed chatting with you. So before we close, any closing comments? Like what? I mean, you can have any closing comments, but if you have to address that to a fresh graduate from college who's entering the workforce, and also if you want to address your closing comments to somebody like me who's been in the business of building software, keeping AI in mind, what would your closing comments be?
I think that the closing comment for me is eventually we spoke about junior developers and we spoke about how this world evolves with AI. I think that today official education is going to be less impactful for the new developers that come into the market. I think that the only way to win is curiosity, learning and asking what you don't know, because the agents will suggest you what you don't know, and eventually just continue asking those questions, continue learning. And just by doing so, you will gain experience because the agent does have the experience of the seniors that it learned from.
Perfect. Thank you so much. With that, folks, we spoke to Nir Valtman, who's the co-founder and CEO of Arnica. I learned a number of things, and I'm sure the rest of you did as well. Thank you so much, Nir, for taking valuable time out of your schedule to having this conversation with me here.
Thanks so much for the invite. Really appreciate it, Krish.
No worries.